Olá, bom dia. Estamos começando o nosso quarto e último dia do curso principal da Escola Paranaense de História e Filosofia da Ciência e da Tecnologia. Gostaríamos de novamente dar as boas-vindas a todos vocês. Estamos aqui eu, Verônica.
Bom dia a todas e todos.
E o Alex.
Olá, pessoal, bom dia. É uma satisfação estar aqui com vocês novamente no evento da escola.
Maravilha. Então, estamos aqui, o trio aqui da comissão organizadora, está faltando só o Ronei aqui conosco, para agradecer vocês bastante, né? Talvez seja o nosso último contato assim, em português. Daqui a pouco nós vamos ouvir o professor Feenberg e o professor Cristiano, que falarão para vocês. Agora, nesse momento, não tem mais tradução, né? A gente não consegue fazer simultaneamente, mas já antecipo para vocês que nós faremos a tradução também, faremos o legendamento dessa entrevista de hoje e deixaremos disponível em algum tempo no nosso canal, tá? Lembrar a todos, né, mais uma vez, que não deixem de registrar a sua presença. A presença deve ser registrada apenas por aqueles que estão inscritos e por aqueles que participaram das 3 sessões anteriores e esperam receber um certificado dessa participação. Os demais já estão registrados aqui, somos muito gratos pela sua participação. Não precisam fazer a indicação da sua presença aqui lá na nossa lista de presença. Por fim, lembrar da nossa foto do evento. Muitos já responderam o e-mail que eu enviei ontem para vocês. Espero que outros tantos o façam até o final do dia de hoje, para que a gente reúna o maior número possível de participantes. Os nossos vídeos estão muito concorridos, né? Nós estamos com vídeos aqui que já chegam perto de 400 acessos, né? O que significa um sucesso. Alguns vídeos são antigos aqui e não tiveram um público tão expressivo. Então, sem mais demora, para que vocês possam aproveitar bastante a manhã de hoje, com a entrevista do professor Feenberg, eu convido, então, vou pedir licença aqui, Verônica e Alex, para retirá-los aqui da nossa tela. Até, pessoal. E eu vou convidar, então, pela ordem, o professor Cristiano e, por fim, o nosso grande convidado de hoje, o professor Feenberg. Professor Feenberg, eu vou falar em português, muito obrigado, e já passo a palavra para o Cristiano, para que ele traduza essas poucas palavras minhas para o senhor e inicie o nosso trabalho. Bom dia, Cristiano, muito obrigado.
Bom dia. So, Professor Eduardo Barra, welcome to you and thank you for your participation here. And I will just make a comment in Portuguese to remind that they can pose questions in Portuguese. Então, a apresentação vai ser feita em inglês, a conversa, mas vocês podem, ao longo das perguntas, vocês podem colocar questões em português, espanhol ou inglês no chat, e daí a gente vai trazer, ao final de cada resposta do professor Feenberg, a gente vai trazer essas questões para ele poder comentar sobre elas, ok? So, first of all, I would like to introduce Professor Feenberg, Andrew Feenberg. So, Andrew Feenberg actually doesn't need to be introduced. Have been granted the Society for Philosophy and Technology's award for lifetime achievement in 2019. He, Professor Andrew Feenberg, is one of the leading references in the philosophy of technology worldwide. He is also a very generous scholar, always willing to participate in academic events like this one. And he's also someone who makes an effort to reach out to a much broader audience than just philosophers. All that helps us to understand why he and his ideas are so popular, also among social scientists and many engineering groups associated with what can be widely defined as engaged engineering. And that's in Brazil. We have a lot of engineering groups, Brazilian engineering groups, that draw on Andrew Feenberg's ideas for their interventions and their reflections on their interventions. So, Andrew, thank you very much for your participation with us today, and also for your previous work regarding this edition of the Paranaense School of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, because you have prepared these 3 video lectures you sent to us, and the students have watched these lectures before. Well, how will this conversation work? We have prepared 3 sets of different questions, and I sent these questions to Andrew yesterday, and we are now going to these questions. I will make the question, and he will reply according to the question asked. Is that okay for us to start, Andrew?
Yes, fine.
Okay. Well, so the first section will deal with the Techno-ciência, which is the main theme of this edition of the Paranaense School of History and Philosophy of Engineering and Science and Technology. And the first question is, what is techno-science to you, Andrew? Do you think that today, besides technology and techno-science, there are also other sciences or sciences? And if so, if there are sciences in addition to techno-science, what distinguishes science and techno-science?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. In your third question, you've asked what's the difference between my view and that of Bernadette Bensaude-Vincent, and I'll just combine the 2 answers here. For the most part, I mean, the word technoscience is a strange word because it's used only by people who are not themselves technoscientists. You never hear engineers talk about themselves as technoscientists, or it's certainly not physicists or chemists. But this term has become popular through science and technology studies and through humanities' interest in science. And it has a certain value because it signals a change in the way we view science. We see it now much more closely connected to technology, to corporate actions, corporate actors, and to the public. And that change alters the scene in an important way. It used to be that there was basic science and then there were applied fields. Now there's a tendency in the humanities and in science and technology studies to lump all that together and call it all technoscience. There's also a more precise use of the term technoscience for example, in Bernadette's lectures, where it is related to specific types of objects that are themselves artifacts. So they're sciences like computer science or nanotechnology work on objects created by human beings, which is quite different from, say, cosmology, which talks about stars that we have no way to create or alter. So there's quite a lot of semantic confusion here. Now, I've thought about how to use the term, and it seems to me that there are two aspects to it that make sense to me. One is the use of the term for technical disciplines of one sort or another that have an aspect that resemble science, that resemble what we think of as science in the old-fashioned sense of the term. These disciplines are often involve artificial objects. For example, a discipline like architecture works entirely with things made by human beings, same as nanotechnology. But these technical disciplines also are very much exposed to public concerns, and they're affected by the reactions of the public to their activities. So if we use technoscience in this very broad sense to cover all the technical disciplines that technify our society, that structure the whole society, then I think the term is a useful contrast term to basic science, which still exists and is still of fundamental importance. For example, the vaccines that we're now using to deal with the pandemic emerged from basic scientific research on genetics, and that research was not originally organized around a business proposition of some sort. It was the fruit of the curiosity of individual scientists who were pursuing certain traditional possibilities opened up by earlier discoveries. And now we know how useful it is. The same thing happened to Einstein's E = mc squared. He had no idea he was going to create a bomb, but 40 years later, 35 years later, that's what happened. So I do think there's a distinction between basic science, even though today it is far more directed by government and corporate agencies. Still, there's such a thing. And the technosciences, and I want to enlarge the term technoscience to cover all the technical disciplines that directly engage with the social world.
Okay, very interesting. And we don't have any comments for now, so I can. Okay, so we are going to the second question.
Yeah.
Of this first section. What are the new or most promising frontiers of technoscience research, in your opinion?
Well, in my definition of technoscience, the work on climate mitigation and the study of climate change and the redirection of the whole energy industry globally. That's the most important thing happening right now that we can talk about in terms of technoscience. Now, there's a great deal of talk about artificial intelligence these days and how it's going to change things, but we don't yet know very much about the applications, that these future applications that are going to have such a big impact. We're still working on things like driverless cars, which is already very, very difficult. So I guess you could say that, yes, there's a promising future for artificial intelligence. But what that future is not at all clear. Corporations have one idea how to use it. Computer scientists may have other ideas. And the public may get involved at some point when it notices the effects. And out of that mix will come something. And that will be quite interesting. But for the moment, if you ask me the question, what's the real frontier? It is saving the planet from climate change.
Yeah, and it's the most urgent one for sure. The third question, you already answered the differences between. Would you like to stress some other differences between your understanding of technoscience and Bernadette's one? Or
well, I just mentioned, in Bernadette's, I haven't seen her videos, but I've seen her notes, and it looks to me like she's focusing specifically on areas like nanotechnology and AI, where there's the two properties I mentioned are present. These are fields that work on artificial objects, and they're also fields in which the corporate interests are directly involved. And I think corporate interests is just a subset of public involvement. I mean, it's a special subset, but it isn't science. It's something else that has to do with concerns of interest to the larger public rather than scientists. So what I've tried to do in my redefinition of the term is to loosen up a bit on the side of the object. Almost any object that, even say something like management, there's a management science, it's a technical discipline. It pretends to be a science. It has many of the characteristics of a science, even though it's obviously not a real science, the way we think of chemistry or even engineering. Still, it belongs to this whole panoply of disciplines, technical disciplines that structure the society, and that have direct effects on the public. And I want to use the term technoscience in that respect, which differs from Bernadette's more narrow and more, I guess, widely accepted view of what technoscience is.
Okay, so based on that, there is a question that came from the audience. So you would say that engineering and the agrarian sciences are examples of technoscience, or there is also, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can go, there was another question, but I will leave this for the second section because it's talking about your instrumentalization, your theory of technology, your philosophy of technology, but I will leave this for the next section. So the fourth question of this first section is, you seem to support and understanding that even though it is legitimate for us to fight for democratizing technology and also technical development, it's not so to pursue the same thing concerning technoscience. Why the difference?
I guess I wouldn't quite agree with the way the question characterizes my position.
Okay.
I think technoscience can also be democratized, but pretty much in the same way as technology. But you have to be really careful about what you mean by democratizing. I don't believe that people without technical competences should intervene in the work of engineers or computer designers or technoscience personnel. They have skills, craft skills. And we have to think of them as craftsmen, artisans. And those craft skills are often quite difficult to acquire. And they belong to a tradition of development of skills, which people have to be introduced to by a lengthy educational process. If you ignore that, the result will certainly be disaster. So, I mean, if you were asked to make a shoe and you knew nothing about shoemaking, your shoe would not fit. And the same could happen if you intervened in the construction of a bridge or in the development of a program for artificial intelligence or the design of a toaster. So, however, that doesn't mean that the public should be excluded. Democratization takes a different form in technical fields than in the political field. In the political field, you can just change the personnel, right? You don't like the president, get rid of him and elect someone else. You can't do that with the technical cadre of a country. If you got rid of them, you'd be stuck. You'd be back to the Middle Ages. So what you need to do is change the technical discipline out of which they operate. And how do you do that? Well, when the public intervenes and makes demands, those demands may change the attitudes and intentions of expert personnel, of corporations, and of governments. And the result may be, I'll give an example. The automobile is a means of transportation, and clearly also for automotive engineers, it's both a means of transportation and also it has a prestige value. And these are both considerations that in automotive engineering are going to be taken into account. And when you're trained in that field, you need to learn about how to make it work. Well, the pollution caused by automobiles has provoked a public reaction, and that reaction has resulted in regulations that force the automotive engineers to change the nature of the object of their discipline. Their discipline now no longer concerns simply a means of transportation. It also concerns an environmental object, and that environmental object adds chapters to their textbooks. Chapters on catalytic converters, on fuel injection, and so on. So you can see how a democratic intervention in this case through protests and lawsuits and concerns over air pollution, has altered the technical discipline, and then that in turn changes the design of the technology. The same thing is happening. Well, for example, facial recognition. Facial recognition is a technology which is being developed with artificial intelligence, with new types of sensors, but what do we want to use it for? What is a legitimate application? The public is intervening in that decision. For example, there's resistance to the idea that it can be used, say, on Facebook, so that every photograph on Facebook can be tagged with the name of the person in it. And then there's problems with race, because black faces don't seem to show up as well. Gee, I wonder why. I mean, the whole thing was created by white people using examples, material from white people's lives as for tests, and so you have this racial problem, which then shows up as a political demand, a demand that the system be made to work for everyone, and so on. So, I mean, you can see how democratic interventions, this is what I call them, not democratic elections, but democratic interventions, right, can alter technology and technoscience as well.
Okay, because in your theory, in your philosophy of technology, you define 3 different strategies for us, for the public, to democratize technology. One is this that you have already mentioned. We can fight, we can make protests to fight for some regulation, or also for some change of the company. So I have a boycott or something like that, and then they have to change. That's the first one of the possibilities. There are 2 other. We can hack what has been done, and the third one, we can make association. We can associate ourselves with the technical personnel, and in order for us to advance the social technical solutions we may want. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that's the fifth question of the first section may help you to illustrate, to exemplify another example of this 3 possibilities of democratization. So the fifth question is, if technoscience is instrumentalized and dominated by the hegemonic economic, military, and political interests, how can grassroots movements manage to have their socio-technical issues, needs, or desires investigated? Take, for instance, the neglected diseases and grassroots agroecology that, according to Hugh Lace and Pablo Mariconda's research, has been neglected for investigation, academic and scientific investigation. So how can we deal with that?
Well, first of all, let's be clear that something unusual has been happening since around the time of the Second World War with regard to the relation of the public to the technosciences. It is true, of course, that the technical structure of our society is created by corporations, the military, and governments, not by us. We are at best the workers who do the work and the users who use the systems. We're outside the principal scene of development. That's true. But on the other hand, publics have succeeded in altering technical systems much more effectively since World War II than at any time before. There have been really major changes. The most dramatic have to do with environmentalism. The environmental movement has had a huge impact on industry, and both through direct protest and through lawsuits and through government regulation. And this impact, which is continuing around climate change, was really, I think, unimaginable before World War II, that you could have such a powerful movement affecting so many different features of the technical world based on public demands. Now, of course, corporations and governments are also interested in the public. They want to serve the public, but within certain limits. And what happens with these democratic interventions is that those limits are breached. So what seemed impossible, for example, seat belts were supposed to be really impossible, too expensive. That would cost thousands of dollars for car buyers to have seat belts in their cars. This is in the 1950s. There was a big fight over seat belts. But so what is really possible? Well, the corporations had one idea. The public, through its representatives in government, demanded seatbelts and got them. And it turned out they were much cheaper and easier to install than the corporations had claimed. And so you see frequent changes in all sorts of different fields. The nets used to catch tuna fish, to make canned tuna, were changed by a boycott because the original nets caught dolphins and killed dolphins, and people like dolphins. So they boycotted canned tuna until the nets were changed so the dolphins, being smart, could figure out how to escape while the dumb tuna got stuck. So, I mean, these may not seem like the most earth-shaking examples, but when you reach, say, changes in medicine and environmentalism, you're talking things that affect everyone and that have huge implications. So now, that doesn't mean that the system now works perfectly for the public. There's still all these constraints, heavy constraints that result from, for example, the market, which weighs on corporations. When you think about all the evil things that Mr. Zuckerberg is doing, you should be aware that he is responding to the market. So, I mean, I still wouldn't really let him off the hook for what he's doing. But it has a logic to it. It's not just bad will on his part. The logic is the logic of the market. How do you become the biggest, the richest, the most powerful? Well, he's doing it. If he hadn't done it, presumably someone else would have, because the slot that he occupies was there and waiting for someone to fill it. And so it's true, the corporate hegemony is the reality, but it's not inflexible. And that, in fact, is why capitalism has survived, because it does respond, and to some extent, it responds to public pressures, and ever more. So as for things like, for example, neglected diseases, in the United States, there was a lot of protest from the organizations of people with rare diseases over the fact that the government didn't seem interested in spending any money finding out the cause and cure. And those protests led to something called the orphan disease legislation. So here's a case where a really serious problem, ignored, neglected by the medical community and the government, was finally taken up. And to some extent, help was found. So I think the case of agroecology this is a field that I don't know enough about, so I can't really comment on it, but it may have a future. Let's hope that it has a future if there's enough public pressure.
Yeah, here in Brazil with agroecology and the studies that Pablo Mariconda have done, there is this associations with some academic university groups that investigate these problems and try to find out and solve some of these issues. There is a question that came from the public that's been screened, and it says that not all practical problem needs a scientific theory to be solved. So wouldn't it be more current for us to say that technology is a specific area of field of knowledge and then different from technoscience, since not always when we deal with in engineering, and we not need always to rely on scientific knowledge, so wouldn't exist a field which is specific and it's different from science and also from technoscience.
Because I don't fully understand the question. Certainly, there are many problems that are treated as technical problems in a highly technified society like ours that aren't really technical problems. They're social problems and should be handled as such. That's a factor, a cultural factor that needs to be better understood, and people need to be better able to distinguish between what are really technical issues and what are in fact normative and political issues, and resist attempts to technify things that shouldn't be technified. I don't see technology and technoscience as so fundamentally different. I'm not sure that's the part of the question I didn't quite understand. Of course, within all scientific fields, there are lots of things that are traditional that are not really scientific, that are, people have learned how to do something and they use it in the science or the technoscience and it works, so they keep on doing it, but they don't really know why. I mean, we still don't know exactly what aspirin does, but doctors continue to prescribe it. So that's true, and that's interesting, but it doesn't really, I think, change the way we. I mean, what you can say is that the boundary between what is really science in the technosciences and what is custom carried down without a full, true scientific basis, that boundary is tested by protest. Otherwise, it's fixed because people, there's inertia. People just go on doing the same thing. But I'll give one example of that, and maybe this will answer the question. In the United States, I can't speak for Brazil, but in the United States, until the early 1970s, partners were not allowed in delivery and labor rooms in obstetric facilities in hospitals. Feminists in the 1970s protested this and demanded that partners be allowed in. And at first, the medical institutions said, well, that's not sanitary. We can't do that. But then they figured out that actually it was quite simple to include the partners. They just had to wash their hands in hexachlorophine soap for 5 minutes and put on a little cap to keep their hair out of the operations, and they could participate. And that makes a big difference for women, for how they feel about this process. So here you can see something that was taken to be a scientific principle of, in this case, sanitation, actually turned out to be just a custom that you could easily throw away if you wanted to change your the way you do things.
Yeah, I think you answered the question, and because there is this, when we think of the epistemology of engineering or technical design, there are many different knowledges that go together in order to substantiate this practice. And sometimes it might seem that we are not using science or other knowledge, but most of the time we are doing this way. So I guess that it was answered. Renato Dagnino, he formulated here on the chat his definition to technoscience that he thinks can support and is current with the ideal of solidarity economy. And I will read this definition to you. And if you can,
who is
Renato Dagnino of Technoscience, of social technology. So his definition is: technoscience is the cognitive outcome of the action of a social actor on a work process that he controls, and that a modification in the generated product that can be appropriated according to his interests.
Yeah, that's a different angle from mine or Bernadette's. I'm not sure I really understand it. I need to perhaps read it to be clear on what he's saying.
Is this here? Definition: Techno-science is the cognitive outcome of the action.
I don't see it in the chat.
No, it's screening on. It's on your screen below. Can't you see this? There is a label there with some. No. Okay, I'll try to.
Oh, I see. Yes, it's so the letters were too small.
His definition is in English. We can forget the Brazilian. And continues. Can we go to the next message? Passar para a próxima, para a continuação da pergunta do Dagnino, para o Feenberg poder ler.
I don't really, I'm not sure I see the point of this definition, because that definition could apply to anything that's being done technically. And why is it just his interests? Why not the interests of the public or the interests of the corporation or the government? Unless the idea here is that this is supposed to be the way technoscience would be working in a solidary economy. In other words, if workers' councils controlled the operations of corporations, but still they would need input from the community, because the community is involved too, not just from themselves.
Okay, we will have opportunity to come back to Renato Dagnino's ideas later on this question. So to finish this first section concerning technoscience, the sixth question is, in a time of widespread political use of negationism, how to defend technoscience and basic science without embracing or encouraging scientism?
That's the big question, isn't it? The science and technology studies started out with the intention of refuting scientism and technocratic imposition on the public sphere, and to open things up so that science would not be taken as a kind of idol, a god, but seen as part of the human experience. And that led to a kind of relativism, which turned out to be very useful to tobacco companies, oil companies, all kinds of bad guys. So now people in science and technology studies are trying to defend science after having exposed it to this. If you can't say that the outcome of a controversy is caused by nature, but is simply the result of the victory of one of the parties to the controversy, then you can't say there's ever any end to controversy, because there'll always be someone, at least in the business world, with an interest in keeping it going. And there'll always be people who you can pay to keep it going. Rogue scientists who who just want money, or people with eccentric views who can be promoted by the media. So even if they're honest, their views are so far from the general consensus that it's useful to some corporate purpose. So the first round of attempting by the STS community to make science more accessible and more part of the social process, the first round seems to have failed, because all they did was empower the bad guys. So we're stuck with the outcome. I think that emphasis should be placed in education, in schools, on science, as considered as a craft that requires skill. So it should be taught. And I think there are people who have in the past thought about doing this, like James Conant, a professor at Harvard who tried to change science education. Science should be taught as a craft, so people have the sense that, yes, it does have results that are from the work of serious effort. It's not just a matter of opinion. But I can't think of any better way to deal with the problem than through education and through giving children a strong sense of how to do things with science, rather than seeing it just as a bunch of propositions which you could be for or against. Right now, of course, we have this problem of anti-vax movements. Which it's quite insane. I mean, it's like people are so distrustful of government that they've decided that when the light says red, they're going to go through, and when it's green, they're going to stop. It's unbelievable to me. But that's where we're at because of the distrust. Not so much, I think, distrust of science, yes, but only as part of a generalized distrust of all authority. The collapse of hegemonic authority is the ultimate cause, and that I think is traceable to some political decisions that were made in the 1980s and 90s that continue to have disastrous effects.
So the next question is the complementary to this for the first one. So how to be critical, the seventh question, how to be critical to technoscience without being a negationist or encouraging negationism?
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, you think about the social movements around climate change. No one is saying, or at least very few people are saying, that we should get rid of science. They're saying, use the science. So the emphasis of social movements around technoscientific issues should be around using the science in different ways, getting a sense. I mean, in STS, we talk about underdetermination. People need to be aware, and that's what the movement organizers should be putting the emphasis on. People need to be aware that there are many different ways to design and to design things. There's no one answer to the question, what should we do with AI? It can be used in many different ways. And the public should be intervening to direct scientists toward the usage that is most consistent with public values. And it's only if people achieve that level of understanding that they have. Of course, they don't need to use the terminology of STS, but they need to have the sense that, yes, things can be designed differently. There are choices. And once people get that idea, then I think they can demand changes without falling into technophobic and negationist ideology.
Yeah, quite interesting answer. Well, with this, we finished this first section of this conversation that was about technoscience, and now the second section. I draw these questions from some friends and colleagues of mine that work as grassroots or popular engineers, as we call them, their way of practicing engineering here in Brazil. And we have three questions that will go with the first one, the eighth question. What would be necessary or desirable characteristics of technologies as material and immaterial artifacts and technosystems that can be supportive of the democratic socialism you seek? Do you think Renato Dagnino's social technology that is committed to the solidarity economy and self-management ideals, do you think that social technology fits the ideal characteristics of this democratic socialist technology or technosystem you envisage? What, now concerning specifically to social technology, what you think would be missing or in excess to this idea of social technology? Well, a lot of questions in only one, but you can deal with this the
I'll
way
do
you
my
want.
best.
Okay.
The key problems that come up with technosciences have to do with interaction between different specialized disciplines. So this especially, you can see this like again with the automobile example. People who study the atmosphere have a specialized discipline in which they can measure pollutants. People who make automobiles have a specialized discipline in which they can figure out how to make cars go. And unless those two disciplines interact, there's no reason why the cars shouldn't pollute the atmosphere. So only if you can organize the interaction of many disciplines do you begin to get something that corresponds to the actual reality that people live. Because that reality is immensely complex, and it crosses all the boundaries, the disciplinary boundaries that we don't want to get rid of the specialized disciplines, because the knowledge involved in each of them is so immense that it is already difficult for people to reach the frontier through their studies. What we want to do is make them aware of each other and get them to interact around problems that concern the public. So I guess it's not so much then characteristics of technologies as material and immaterial artifacts that I'm concerned about. It's the interaction of these disciplines in the design process, which would allow designs to emerge that are better adjusted to the needs of the population. Now, the second part of the question is about self-management as a way of organizing a socialist society. And I guess I am in general agreement. But of course, since there's so many externalities of modern technology, it's also important that in the administration of technical institutions, there be representatives of the public, of those, for example, the community that, say, if we're talking about a factory, that factory should be under the generalized control of its workforce. Those workers can form a assembly that chooses management the way today management is chosen by stockholders. I don't think that would be a big change, except perhaps in priorities of things like health and safety on the job. But the community also needs to be involved, because the factory in which these workers labor may produce wastes and may have effects on the environment. And those should be represented in the councils of the organized administration of the factory. So I think it would be quite complicated to develop an effective system of solidary economy. But it was probably pretty hard to get capitalism to work the way it does too. So there's certainly an evolutionary path that would have to be explored to find the right solutions. But at the bottom, I agree with Renato that at the bottom there should be a kind of system of workers' control.
Okay, so because you think the ideal regime you think of is what we call democratic socialism. Is that correct?
Well, the term democratic socialism is used for different things. Some, for example, I don't really know what the right solution is.
Okay.
But the idea of some form of self-management by populations seems to me the key idea. How that is implemented, whether it's through a market-based system or some new kind of planning using modern means of such as computers, I don't know.
Okay, but you think that considering this ideal, even though we cannot delineate it very clearly, do you think that there are some characteristics that should be present at the technology solutions built and the technical system that will support this system?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I understand the implication of the question. I just said, yes, the technology should be designed with an awareness of all the disciplines that could become engaged in their effects. And so we need a more totalizing view of what you're doing because now the technologies are so powerful that they affect so many domains of life that it's really dangerous to allow them to be isolated from the public and from each other.
Okay, and because the question as it was brought to me, these engineers, they were trying to figure out if there was a horizon of the technical solution they would be trying to design. So we should have this, self-management is something that should be accomplished and acknowledged, and some other features. But if I'm understanding you properly, what you think to suggest, what I think you are suggesting is that we cannot anticipate this final solution, but you are more concerned with the path, the method, how to achieve or how to construct a technical design process through which we can, like with this, the totalized understanding of reality as much as possible, and incorporating as many as possible the actors which are implicated. We cannot know in advance what this solution will look like, but we can try to keep some things in the method to achieving this, in order for this to be achieved the best way possible.
See, there's a question of power here, right?
Yeah.
The design of particular technologies and of technical systems is governed by questions of power. Who has access to the design process? Whose concerns are considered priorities? And if the process is governed ultimately by the market and people who are responsive to the market, you get one result, and over the long term, that can have huge effects on the design of the whole civilization. So, for example, the de-skilling of labor in the 19th century and early 20th century, the idea of getting rid of all those craftsmen and having all the work be done by children and women, and then eventually by assembly line workers, that whole process is responsive to the imperatives of capitalism. And workers were not consulted. Communities were not consulted. Their exclusion had effects that we live with today. And we're undoing some of those effects now. And same thing with environmental problems, right? We're undoing some of the effects of a design process that excluded communities. So the power question is really critical. That's why democracy is important, because democracy means that people other than corporate leaders responding to the market have power in the design process, and that will have long-term effects, not maybe immediate effects on much, but in the long run, big effects. It'll create a different technical civilization. So that's why I think the democracy question is tied up with the technology question in a fundamental way.
Okay, so I guess that's a very good point for us to go to the next question that I think that deals with some of these problems you just mentioned. But also the ninth question is, given the huge power of capitalism to shape identities, desires, values, and knowledge, do you think that the way to democratic socialism or to something else, something different from this technocratic capitalism we have, can be left to spontaneous mobilizations of concerned citizens and people? How could we break the capitalist spell or the power? Because it's very subtle many times. We don't see we being shaped this way as individualists, as consumerists. And so how can we break this capitalist spell that capitalism, this power capitalism have? If the mobilizations are not sufficient for constructing, for a way out of this technocratic cage we live in, what else should or could we seek?
Well, I guess I'm less ambitious than Renato in thinking about strategies and futures. I think the existence of so many social movements around technical issues, around problems of urban design. Do we want to have more transportation, public transportation, more cars? What to do with bicycles? People are concerned about things like that and get involved. That's part of the techno system, urban design. Then there are problems around climate change, around medicine, so on. All these movements, they don't concern the largest number of people the way, say, a revolutionary mobilization would, but they gradually affect people's understanding of the technical system in which they live. And out of that can come a very different spirit, a very different mentality, which sees the society in a let's say, reverses the order of priorities from the success of the market in the market to success as a civilization, as a way of life. And I mean, that's my hope, is that will lead to something much more drastic than just better nets for tuna. I'm hoping that it will also not just have the negative effect of stopping climate change before it's too late, but also some positive effects on the way people understand life but I don't see how to go beyond. I guess I just don't see how to speculate further. Maybe we will encounter such tremendous problems with climate change over the next 20, 30 years that it will create a fundamental desire for fundamental change, and social movements powerful enough to make that change happen. That would be very, very good, but I don't know how to predict such a thing. Okay. I would agree that the small-scale movements that we see are by themselves insufficient to get rid of the present system. They will mitigate some of its harms and make life easier, and this is quite important. For example, the position of women in society has been radically changed since the 1950s. That's really pretty remarkable. That's a huge change. So that was not done by a revolution. That was done by social movements. And so we're hoping that similar pressures around climate change will save us from climate disaster. But but that's not insignificant. These are really important factors of change that tend to be underestimated.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree. So the last question of the second section is because perhaps it's misreading of mine of your text, your ideas, but sometimes it seems to me that even with techno-science and technology, we were to divide these two fields, but you defend that we can democratize technology and we should fight for this. But sometimes, most of the time, when at least as I understand or interpret your texts, it seems that it's enough just to fight for changing the technical codes, and we do not need to try to change the technical disciplines more broadly. And so the question goes as this: in order for us to gradually construct the socio-technical basis of democratic socialism, or to leave the system we have now, is it enough to fight for accordingly changing the technical codes of engineering and other technical disciplines? Or this also must have to change or enlarge epistemically, meaning the supporting technical knowledge should be fighted to a certain extent to be enlarged, not to be denied. It's not a anti technology or anti-engineering, but to enlarge their capabilities, either both epistemically and ontologically. And ontologically, I mean concerning the reality and technology, what they are, what engineers and technical personnel see reality as they are, because they are formed, they are taught in a certain way, and also the technical object they construct, and what they can be. Do you get the question? The point is okay, you get, okay, cool.
I'm not sure I get it.
Okay.
You say to fight accordingly, changing the technical codes or engineering and the other technical disciplines. Do you mean and engineering and the other technical disciplines?
And
okay.
Is only this, is it necessary, according to you, in your understanding, just for us, the lay people, but concerned people, to fight to change technical codes? Or you think that this new possible social technical system would need technical sciences more broadly changed or widened?
Well, I think the intervention of the public might, right now, often to the people who do the technical work, often seems irrational, confused, they don't like it, gets in the way of doing their job. I think there is definitely a need for a change in that attitude. The arrogance of the technical expert needs to be diminished, and they need to see themselves as working for the public and seeking to find, not just from their corporate masters, but also from public opinion, how to do the right way to do things. So there is certainly a need for a change. It's not so much about technical knowledge and ontology as about the orientation of the disciplines, the technical disciplines, toward their task. Now, changes in the technical code have repercussions on the technical disciplines. So, for example, if you're an automotive engineer, I assume that today, unlike in, say, 1955, you think immediately, as part of your concern as an engineer, about the environmental pollution that cars cause. So, I mean, that's a change that's a pretty important change, right, in the mentality, because it involves integrating into the automotive engineering discipline the consequences of another science, right, of climate science and medical science. So these other disciplines now are internal to automotive engineering through the change in the object of the automobile. So those kinds of changes should proliferate and create a very different mentality in the people who do the work, right? because now they're going to be aware of all these other aspects of their objects. But as for I guess that I would say, yeah, that is a change in technical knowledge and in the ontology.
Okay. Renato Agnino put this way. I guess you would agree, but just I think it's more clear this way. If this new social technical system, whatever it is, that's built from the bottom up in a democratic way, they would need for us to change. We would have to change, or it would be necessary or desirable for us to change the research and the teaching we have in the technical disciplines areas at universities.
Sure. Right now, the specializations are much too isolated from each other, and the demands made. The educational system makes such strong demands. You know, it's like to become a doctor, to become an engineer, you go down a very narrow tunnel, and there's hardly any time to read a book. My father was a scientist, and he was educated in the 1930s. And it seemed normal to him to have read literature, history, to learn a language, all that. And his colleagues all were like that. They were intellectuals. Now people are being forced to be technicians without any larger view than the immediate technical work that they're supposed to do. And that's a terrible thing. That is one of the reasons why there's so many problems with the technology, that people don't have a broader view. They're not encouraged to think more widely about what they're doing and its implications. So, I mean, you know, if you have all these very high-level skills and you're doing something that very few people in the world are capable of doing, you should not have the mentality that is appropriate to driving a truck or fixing a toilet. You should be part of the broader culture of the society. Of course, even the people who drive trucks and fix toilets should have the opportunity to learn more, and that should be something that interests them as human beings. But in the case of people with high technical skills, it's not just about being a human being. It's also about doing the job in a way that is responsible, because the risks and dangers of the work are far beyond anything that existed in the past. And it's just as we become capable of ruining everything that we've decided that the people who can do it should stop thinking.
Yeah, very good point. And with that, we finish the second section, and we go to the third one. And I would start this with a question that came earlier on this conversation from the audience, and it was asked to you if you could identify and exemplify and explain the difference between the substantivist view of technology, instrumentalist, and there is the third one I forgot, and yours. So if you can present a
very briefly, the substantivist view. This has to do with the relation of values to technology and the relation and the way technology develops. So one view, the substantivist view, holds that technology has its own inherent values, which change the things that it is applied to. So something like food, for example, when it is technified and becomes, you know, something you put in the microwave, it's been altered. The food has been altered in the values that it carries, the associations that go with it, all the things that food used to mean, say, in the family ritual of the dinner and so on, now disappear, and what you have is just calories. So the substantivist view would argue that technifying has this reductive quality and destroys social and moral relations. A instrumentalist view would say, no, technology doesn't have any inherent values. It just does what we want it to do. And the critical view argues that technical systems embody values that can be changed, that are subject to change. So in a sense, the substantivists were right in saying that the technologies do change the value structure, but they were wrong in saying that it's the fact of technology in itself that does this. Instead, it's the design of systems. That's what the critical view would argue. It's the design of technical systems that has this effect on social values.
Cristiano, o seu microfone foi desligado.
Sorry. The fourth one I forgot is the determinist view.
The determinist view would hold that the technology has to be what it is at each stage, and it develops progressively toward better and better solutions. The problem with the determinist view is, and also that society must adapt as the technologies advance. The problem with this view is that it doesn't take into account the underdetermination of technology, the fact that different designs are possible, and in many cases, the differences, although they might be technically rather small, have big social implications. So you're talking about living in a different society. If, for example, you substituted public transportation for automobiles in a modern city, that would be a huge change in the life of the people in the city. But technically, it's no big deal. All the technology is available. Everyone knows how to do this. So the fact that systems can be designed in very different ways and individual technologies also in very different ways contradicts the determinist assumption that society must adapt to technology. Rather, it's a two-way street. Technologies create opportunities, and the system, the social world, can alter them.
Thank you very much for this brief presentation explanation. So we go now to the 11th question. Now we the main aspect of the third section, we can go, we have about 20 minutes, but is we try to, we from the Global South, we try to establish some dialogue between what is being said and researched at the North, Global North, and try to make sense this according to other possibilities. And so we start with Yuki Hui's cosmotechnical theory. So Yuki Hui's cosmotechnical theory heavily relies on anthropology, particularly on authors like Viveiros de Castro and De Cola from the ontological turn in anthropology, to whom human peoples like the Amerindian peoples experience realities different from the hegemonic capitalist and disenchanted one. So reality experienced by Amerindians and many other traditional people is different. Their experience is different from the experience we modern people, westernized modern people do. On the other hand, you seem to be closer to sociology and appear to support the understanding of a singular nature, what these anthropologists call mono-naturalism, and many possible cultures, which is multiculturalism. So the question is, do you think emancipatory movements from the Global South and social technical interventions can learn how to improve their actions, their reflection from Yuki Huis and other theorists that draw on the ontological turn?
Well, this is a very complicated philosophical question. I don't agree that my position is one of a singular nature and multiculturalism. that's not a good characterization of my position. I'm very strongly influenced by phenomenology. And so I don't think that natural science is the ultimate ontology. We don't know the nature of reality in some ultimate sense that would exclude other possibilities through natural science. On the other hand, natural science isn't false. It's not just a myth. It has tremendous power to organize experience and to achieve goals. So what we need to do is we need to think in terms of two natures, not one. There's the nature that is defined by natural science, which has certain properties that we value. And there's the nature that is defined by everyday experience that has rather different properties. For example, in everyday experience, we see things in a teleological way. We view people, for example, as engaged in a growth process. We see plants as flowering. That's something that they do. They achieve their end, which is to flower. We look at the world in terms of potentialities. Now, in physics, there is a concept of potential, but it is strictly defined by things that are already present. It doesn't have any, there's the potential energy of something that is held above the earth. If you let go of it, it will fall and release the potential energy. But all this is calculable, whereas there's something incalculable about, say, the growth of a child. The potentiality that is unleashed in that developmental process is not something that you can calculate in advance. So our experience of the world contains many aspects that are not adapted, that simply cannot fit into the way nature is defined by natural science. We have a nature that is in many ways different from the nature of natural science and also valid. Now, that means that you can validate other cultures than our own, but all of them have this structure of teleological structure. This is something that you can find already. I mean, Aristotle worked this out in an objectivistic way in ancient Greece, and it's a good way to think about how the life world of all the various cultures in the world differ from the scientific view of the world. It's a key point in the difference, but there are, of course, many other differences. So the problem isn't to decide which is right, science or culture, and it's not about tolerating different cultures. Of course, you should tolerate different cultures, but it's about how to articulate these two different natures, because they interfere with each other constantly. So, for example, what do we think the cause of climate change is? We're all concerned about it. Why? What do we think it is? Well, we get the idea from the sciences, right? We know it's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, there are some people who think that it's because God is angry at us for having tolerated homosexual marriage. But we regard their life world is one which we regard as damaged and dangerous. We're not anxious to validate their idea. So, I mean, it's not as though everything goes, but what this is a complicated and contingent process in which there's interaction between science and the life world, and that interaction results in the sort of democratic interventions I've discussed, but it could also result in bad things. So we're not really liberated from the problem of, having a normative stance, of deciding what's right and wrong by having an idea of the viability of life worlds. At the same time, look, we live in a modern world, and it has intruded everywhere. And so much of the content of life worlds must be translated into scientific technical terms in order to survive and to have some effect and to make sense in the modern world. So there is a constant process of translation back and forth, science intervening by giving us an understanding of our environment that we could not have had on a pure basis of our customs and traditions, and the life world intervening in science by orienting it toward problems that and values that we elaborate in our understanding of the everyday nature around us. And these are interaction processes, translation processes that I think are the key to understanding what's going on in the world today. Not some kind of one-sided preference for either natural science or culture.
Well, thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes. So I go perhaps the last question or the last two questions, okay?
Yeah.
So the 12th question is, do you think your double instrumentalization theory also fits other cosmologies or worldviews than the hegemonic capitalist one or the modern one? For instance, the Amerindian cosmology or worldview is based on a perspectivist comprehension according to which humans and non-humans animal species are among and to themselves inside this each species. They see themselves as humans, while they see the other species as non-human animals. So if nature is something with fatalities and potentialities on its own, not asserted, defined, or acknowledged as such by human beings, and regarding exclusively to our own well-being, could we always take the primary instrumentalization as you define it?
Since we have very little time left, I'm going to go quickly.
Okay.
I think that the basic idea of the instrumentalization theory, that there is, in our relationship to technical work of one sort or another, there is a combination of elements of technical, specifically technical understanding of causal relations and cultural aspects that grant meaning and define limits. I think that's valid for everybody, not just for us. I mean, I think if you asked a member of a Brazilian tribe that isolated from the modern civilization, how they made a house, say, they could give you all kinds of information about the technical work they were doing. That sounds just like what a carpenter would be saying if they had the same means at their disposal. Like, how do you keep it from falling down? What's the best stuff to use for the walls? What kind of ceiling resists the rain better? And I mean, all of that would be this. But of course, it's a house, and so it has a specific meaning in the culture, and perhaps some ritual significances that affect what kind of materials are considered valid materials. So I think that the theory is generalizable. In the same way, say that music theory is generalizable. We can, ideas about harmony, rhythm, and so on work just fine for tribal dances, and there's no reason not to use these concepts. Now, of course, these non-Western, non-modern peoples might offer quite different explanations, but we can translate between our explanations and theirs without too much difficulty. So, I mean, this is our way. The musicologist has to use concepts like rhythm and harmony, which might not have the same, might not be discussed in the same terms by people in a tribal society, but you could figure out between the, by conversation, you could figure out that you were actually talking about the same things.
So Andrew, well, I guess we are going to heading to concluding this conversation. I wrote in order for me to prepare something more appropriate. I wrote a brief paragraph for thank you, but I really mean it, because listening to you, I've been studying your ideas, your texts since 2013, I guess. And every time I listen to you, I learn something different I haven't noticed before. So I wrote this way, this thank you message. Once again, Andrew, thank you very much for your time, generosity, and collaboration. It's said about the classics that we always have something to learn from them, no matter how many times we have read or heard them. That is the experience I make over and over again in my interactions with you and your texts. And I mean it. It's always I learn a lot. And another thing I would like to stress in this thank you message is your generosity. You are, a reference in the field of philosophy, technology, and have many things to do, and you always accept our invitations to participate in our events, and it's remarkable. We really thank you for this, and it's something I would like to compliment you about, because it's remarkable. So thank you very much for your participation and your generosity.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to people in Brazil. It's a wonderful country that I wish I could visit again someday when the pandemic is over.
Sure.
Okay.
So I return to now, Eduardo, how we will end. Como é que a gente vai fechar aqui o evento? A gente...
Não, já estou de volta aqui. Então, Cristiano, muito obrigado. Eu já retirei o professor Feenberg aqui da nossa transmissão. Agradeço muitíssimo a sua competente condução, brilhante condução dessa entrevista. Fechamos de maneira esplêndida o nosso evento com essa última entrevista. Então, muito obrigado. Esqueci de dar as boas-vindas tanto ao Feenberg quanto a você, Cristiano, à Universidade Federal do Paraná e à Universidade Tecnológica Federal do Paraná, mas sejam futuramente uma outra oportunidade da mesma forma muito bem-vindos, e esperamos então poder, como diz o Feenberg ao final, né, nos encontrar pessoalmente, tão logo essa onda de pandemia nos possa permitir encontros pessoais. Muito obrigado, então, a todos. Continuamos hoje, para finalizar o nosso evento na parte da tarde, com a última sessão das oficinas, e queremos deixar aqui o nosso agradecimento da maneira mais carinhosa possível a cada um de vocês, a cada uma de vocês que acompanhou o nosso evento, e esperar que numa próxima oportunidade, quando fizermos a próxima edição, pelo menos, tenhamos a possibilidade de nos encontrarmos pessoalmente. Um abraço a todos, muito obrigado, um bom dia, um bom final de semana.